Margaret sat by the wide front window of her home in Vermont, her eyes following the golden leaves drifting across the yard. The house was filled with silence, a silence with weight to it, thick and unmoving, the kind that pressed softly yet insistently against her chest, reminding her of all that no longer filled her days. Years had gone by since her husband's death, but the absence he left remained like an echo that refused to fade. Even now, the evidence of him reached her through the smallest details. The vacant chair across from her at the table, the untouched side of the bed where the quilt never wrinkled, the monotonous scrape of her fork against the plate at dinner. She had grown accustomed to those quiet reminders, but there were afternoons, particularly ones glazed in autumn gold like this, when the solitude felt sharper, heavier, more present. The faint aroma of cinnamon drifted from the tea she had just poured, its warmth a small comfort against the cool stillness. Margaret cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat settle into her palms, as if steadiness might seep in with it. From outdoors came the distant laughter of children, their bright voices slipping through the crisp air. That carefree sound, rising and falling like birdsong, brushed up against her heart with both sweetness and ache. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to borrow a sliver of that easy joy, to feel that weightless energy again. But her life had slowed, its once busy rhythm giving way to the measured pace of days defined by ritual and recollection. Time could not be rewound. It could only stretch forward in its quiet gravity. Her son Daniel had been stopping by more often lately. In his early 30s, he was tall, composed, thoughtful. A man stitched from both his father's quiet strength and a natural tenderness that was entirely his own. Margaret noticed how easily he filled the house not with noise, but with presence, with the unspoken kindness of small acts. One week he tightened the loose cupboard door. Another, he carried in heavy grocery bags or changed burnt-out bulbs before she even noticed them. He never called attention to these things, but each gesture lightened something in her chest. She told herself he was simply being a good son, dutiful and caring. Yet there lingered in his eyes, especially in the pauses, a depth she couldn't quite place, a glimmer of emotion that hinted at something wordless and profound. That particular afternoon, the low hum of an approaching engine reached her ears. The sound of his car tires crunching the gravel driveway lifted her heart involuntarily. She rose, smoothed her sweater, and moved toward the front door just as Daniel rounded the walkway. He carried a modest bag of groceries, his smile gentle, his expression earnest. "I thought you might need a few things," he said lightly, stepping over the threshold with a familiar ease that filled the silent space. There was warmth in his smile, but also something contained, something he wasn't yet ready to let show. Together they drifted into the kitchen, slipping into the quiet rhythm of unpacking, the shuffle of paper bags, clinking jars, and the soft cadence of their shared routine. Daniel asked about her day. She offered simple, comforting details: her morning walk, the neighbor's new puppy that barked at falling leaves, the novel she had just begun. He listened with such true attention that it made her feel seen in a way few people could. His steady presence was a soft light in the dim corners her solitude often left behind. When everything was put away, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The sunlight slanted low through the window blinds, spilling across the wooden surface in ribbons of gold. Margaret wrapped her hands around her tea again, while Daniel absently stirred his coffee, spoon clinking rhythmically against the ceramic. His thoughts seemed distant, wandering somewhere she couldn't follow. She had learned over the years not to chase his silences. He always spoke when ready. The clock ticked, not abrasively, but insistently enough to mark the stillness between them. Margaret could feel, amid that quiet, an unfamiliar calm taking root, not the resigned peace of loneliness, but the grounded warmth that came from simple togetherness. Her gaze drifted to Daniel. In that late light, she could almost see his father in the strong line of his jaw and the slant of his shoulders. Yet, unlike his father's stoic presence, Daniel carried an inward gentleness, a patience that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within. Pride, love, and a faint ache surged through her chest in an indistinct mixture. When Daniel finally stopped stirring and looked directly at her, something in the moment shifted. The easy domestic quiet folded in on itself, replaced by a fragile anticipation. His eyes held a sincerity so intense it startled her. Margaret felt her breath catch, her pulse slowing to match the steady, waiting hush. She didn't yet know why, but she sensed, deeply, that the afternoon had turned onto a different path. Whatever came next would alter the still balance of the room in ways she couldn't undo. The kitchen felt unusually quiet as the late afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, casting long shadows across the table. Margaret sat opposite Daniel, her tea untouched, the steam curling upward before fading into the air. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands clasped loosely around his coffee mug. His eyes were thoughtful, his expression distant, as though he was rehearsing words inside his head. Margaret had seen this look before he wore it when he had something heavy to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. She waited, patient, her fingers lightly tapping the rim of her teacup. She had always been careful not to press him. He was like his father in that way, needing space before revealing what lay in his heart. The ticking of the wall clock filled the pause, steady and almost too loud in the stillness. Margaret thought about filling the silence with a question, perhaps something simple about work or his friends. But before she could, he spoke. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice soft yet firm, "I don't like seeing you alone all the time." The words startled her, not because of their content, but because of the emotion threaded through them. He spoke with a mix of concern and determination, as though he had thought about this for a long while. Margaret shifted in her chair, trying to keep her tone light. "That's very sweet of you to say, Daniel. But I'm fine. I've managed for years now." Daniel shook his head gently. "That's just it. You've managed. But managing isn't the same as living. You deserve more than quiet rooms and empty days. You deserve someone by your side, someone who looks after you, someone who makes you smile." His words lingered in the air, pressing into her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. Margaret had told herself she was content, that she had accepted her life as it was. Yet hearing Daniel say aloud what she had tried to bury made something shift inside her. She felt both seen and exposed at the same time. Finally, she managed to laugh, though it sounded weaker than she intended. "That's kind of you, Daniel. But at my age, it's not so simple. Things like that don't just happen anymore." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers, steady and unwavering. "Then let me be that someone, at least until you find the happiness you deserve." The words fell into the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret froze, her hand gripping the teacup tighter than before. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him, but the sincerity in his expression left no room for doubt. His voice hadn't wavered. His eyes hadn't shifted. He meant every word. Her heart raced, her thoughts tumbling in every direction. This was not the kind of offer a son usually made to his mother, and yet there was nothing careless about his tone. It wasn't playful or casual. It was earnest, almost protective, as if he had decided this long ago and had finally gathered the courage to say it. Margaret's throat tightened. She searched for words but found none. The kitchen clock ticked louder, each second stretching into what felt like a minute. She studied her son's face, hoping for a clue, perhaps a sign that he had spoken injustice, that he would laugh it off. But Daniel didn't move. His gaze remained steady, his shoulders firm, his silence daring her to respond. Finally, she placed her teacup on the table with trembling hands. "Daniel," she whispered, unsure of her own voice, "do you realize what you're saying?" "I do," he replied calmly, though his eyes carried a softness that made her heart ache. "I know it sounds unusual, but I've watched you all these years, Mom. You've given so much, carried so much, and you've been alone for too long. If no one else is here to give you the happiness you deserve, then let me do it. Let me take care of you." The weight of his words pressed heavily against her chest. Margaret wanted to protest, to remind him that she was his mother, that such an offer blurred lines that should never be crossed. Yet something inside her hesitated. It was the way he looked at her, so certain, so full of devotion. It wasn't just the protective love of a son. It carried something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, but could feel stirring in her bones. She turned her gaze toward the window, the fading sunlight painting the yard in amber tones. Her reflection stared back faintly in the glass, and she hardly recognized the woman she saw. A woman caught between gratitude, shock, and a confusing warmth she wasn't ready to admit. The silence stretched long between them, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Margaret felt her heart pound louder than those sounds, each beat echoing in her ears. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now, but no less steady. "You don't have to answer, Menno. I just wanted you to know how I feel. I don't want you to carry life alone anymore." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands resting in her lap to hide their trembling. She nodded faintly, unable to find words. Her mind spun with questions, doubts, and feelings she dared not say aloud. Part of her wanted to scold him, to remind him of boundaries, to tell him this was not a path they could ever walk. Yet another part of Hertha, part that had been lonely for so long, felt a flicker of warmth at his words, a dangerous warmth she didn't dare acknowledge. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel. That's very thoughtful of you." But inside, nothing felt simple anymore. As Daniel finished his coffee and rose to wash his cup, Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles. His words had unsettled her, shaking the quiet rhythm of her life in a way she hadn't expected. She knew nothing would be the same again, and as she watched him rinse his cup at the sink, the golden light of evening framing his silhouette, she realized she would carry the weight of his offer long after the dishes were put away. Margaret woke the next morning, still replaying Daniel's words in her mind. "Let me buy that someone." The sentence had followed her into her dreams, echoing in the quiet corners of her heart. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was nothing more than a son's way of expressing care. But the way he had looked at her, the calm conviction in his voice, it hadn't sounded casual. It had felt heavier, layered with something she couldn't name. She moved through her day as if everything were normal. Yet her thoughts betrayed her. While folding laundry, she remembered the way his eyeshad lingered on hers. While making tea, she remembered the warmth in his tone. Even as she watered the plants on the porch, she found herself wondering if anyone had ever spoken to her with such devotion since her husband's passing. The loneliness that had lived quietly in her for years stirred, rising in ways she didn't expect. Daniel arrived that evening carrying a bag of groceries and a bouquet of fresh daisies. "Thought you could use these?" he said with an easy smile, setting them on the counter. Margaret's breath caught for a moment. She couldn't remember the last time someone had brought her flowers just because. She thanked him softly, arranging them in a vase, Kea fingers trembling slightly as she placed them on the kitchen table. Dinner was simple grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. They ate together, their conversation flowing lightly at first. Daniel asked about her book, about the neighbor's new puppy, about whether she had considered joining a local art class. Margaret answered, though her words came slower than usual. Every time their eyes met across Thettable, she felt a strange current pass through her. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it unsettled her because she couldn't explain it. After dinner, Daniel insisted on washing the dishes while she dried them. They stood side by side at the sink, their movements quiet and practiced as though they had done this together for years. Margaret noticed the way his shoulder brushed against hers, the way he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts neither dared to voice. Later, they sat in the living room with cups of tea. The air smelled faintly of daisies and soap, and the soft hum of their refrigerator carried from the kitchen. Margaret tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred on the page. She could feel Daniel's presence beside her, steady and warm, filling the space that had so often felt hollow. Her heart fluttered at small things. The way he leaned closer when showing her something on his phone, the way he laughed gently at her jokes, the way his gaze lingered on her face just a second too long. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was reading too much into gestures born out of care. Yet deep down she knew something had shifted. That night Daniel left. Margaret lingered by the door long after his car had disappeared down the street. The house returned to its silence, but it didn't feel the same. His presence clung to the rooms, filling them with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She carried the vase of daisies into her bedroom and placed them on the nightstand, staring at their bright petals as she lay down. Sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, hearing his voice in her mind. You deserve someone by your side. She thought of his father, of the years they'd shared, of the comfort of being loved. She also thought of how long it had been since anyone had looked at her the way Daniel had. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. In the days that followed, she watched Daniel with new eyes. when he fixed the squeaky door hinge, when he carried the heavy boxes from the attic, when he surprised her with her favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery. She noticed the care in every gesture. She wondered if she had overlooked this before, or if something truly had changed between them. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Margaret caught the way people looked at them. To strangers, they might have seemed like any other pair, enjoying the crisp autumn air together, but in her heart, she felt the weight of his words pressing against every step. She wondered if others could see it, if the closeness, the unspoken tenderness lingering in the space between them. At night, alone in her room, she scolded herself for letting her thoughts wander. She was his mother. She had to keep the lines clear. Yet, no matter how sternly, she reminded herself, the memory of his offer stayed alive, glowing faintly like embers that refused to die. One evening, Daniel lingered longer than usual after dinner. They sat on the porch, wrapped in sweaters against the chill, watching the stars appear one by one in the sky. The night was quiet, only the distant sound of crickets filling the air. Margaret felt the weight of his presence beside her, close enough that their arms brushed lightly. She wanted to ask him what he had meant that day, wanted to hear him explain again, but her words stuck in her throat. If she asked, she feared the answer. If she didn't, Thessalance would haunt her. Torn between wanting clarity and wanting to preserve the fragile peace, she chose silence. Daniel, too, seemed content to let the night pass without speaking of it. Yet when he turned his head and smiled at her, a soft, knowing smile, Margaret felt her heart skip. It was not the smile of a son humoring his mother. It carried something deeper, something that lingered long after he said goodnight. That night, lying in bed, Margaret finally admitted to herself that she was afraid. Afraid of what his words had stirred, afraid of the longing she felt, but couldn't confess. Afraid of what it meant to let those thoughts grow. Yet despite her fear, one truth remained clear. She couldn't forget his offer. She couldn't silence the way it had made her feel. Wanted, seen, cherished. The silence between them wasn't just silence anymore. It was a space filled with questions, unspoken emotions, and the dangerous possibility of something more. The porch was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold its breath. The air was cool, touched with a faint smell of pine drifting from the woods beyond the yard. Margaret sat in her usual chair, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Beside her, Daniel leaned back with a calm ease, his eyes fixed on the sky where the first stars flickered into view. They had been sitting like that for a while, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with words. Margaret found herself listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the soft sound grounding her more than anything else had in years. The stillness wasn't heavy. It was tender, filled with the quiet comfort of being together. At last, Daniel turned to her. His expression was gentle, but his eyes carried the same weight they had the day he made his offer. "You don't have to give me an answer," he said softly, almost as though he feared breaking the spell of the night. "I just want you to know, you'll never face life alone as long as I'm here." The words struck her like a chord she both longed for and dreaded. Margaret's throat tightened, her chest rising with a sharp breath. She wanted to answer, wanted to tell him everything she felt, but her voice faltered. Instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his. His fingers tightened around hers without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for that single gesture. They sat hand in hand beneath the stars, the silence between them alive with unspoken truths. Margaret's heart thudded with emotions she couldn't name. She knew this moment wasn't ordinary yet, was one of those rare pieces of time that stays etched forever. When Daniel finally rose to leave, he pressed her hand one last time before stepping down the porch steps. "Good night." He said with a warmth that wrapped around her long after he disappeared into the night. Margaret stayed seated, staring at the spot where he had stood, her mind caught in a whirl of thoughts. Was it only devotion speaking through him? The care of a son who couldn't bear to see her lonely? Or was it something deeper? Something neither of them dared to define. Days turned into weeks, yet his words never left her. She moved through her routines, tidying the house, cooking simple meals, reading books, beauty at the edges of everything she did. His voice lingered. "You'll never face life alone as long as I'm here." It was a promise, and it pulsed in her chest like a heartbeat. Every time Daniel visited, she noticed the small ways he kept that promise. He fixed the crooked step on the porch without being asked. He stayed late to help her sort through old photo albums. He brought her favorite pastries on Saturday mornings, always remembering the kind she liked best. Each gesture reminded her of that night of his vow, of the way his hand had closed around hers with such certainty. Margaret often found herself staring at him when he wasn't looking, searching for answers in his face. Did he know how much those words had changed her? Did he realize how they haunted her evenings? How they made her heart ache with a confusing mix of gratitude and longing? She never asked. She feared asking would break the fragile balance they had built. Years later, when the daisies he once brought had long faded, and the seasons had turned again and again, Margaret still remembered that night as if it were yesterday. She remembered the way the stars looked brighter, the way the night air felt charged with something unspoken, the way his voice had carried both tenderness and weight. She never spoke of it to anyone. It became her secret, a memory she held close, tucked away like a hidden letter in the back of a drawer. She carried it into her quiet evenings, into her sleepless nights, into the moments when loneliness pressed too hard against her chest. His offer, his promise, became a thread she wove through her heart to remind herself she was not forgotten. Sometimes as she sat again on the porch in the cool evenings, she would close her eyes and feel the ghost of his hand in hers. She would hear his voice steady, warm, certain, and it would comfort her in ways no other words ever had. She never knew if Daniel had meant more than devotion. If his offer had carried layers she hadn't dared tunefold. All she knew was that it had changed her. It had reminded her that love in its many forms could still find her even in the quiet years of her life. And so, though time kept moving forward, though the world around her shifted, that single moment on the porch remained untouched. His unexpected offer still played in her mind, a melody that never faded, a memory she carried with both gratitude and wonder.